I think I was supposed to wait 3 seconds. Sorry about that. Good evening, everyone. It's great to see you here tonight. My name is John Knight. I am the Director of Faculty Research and Chair of the Lectures Committee here at Virginia Theological Seminary. And on behalf of Dean Markham, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2024 Costan Lectures. The Costan Lectures are the premier academic lecture series at Virginia Theological Seminary, and they are instituted with the generosity of Margaret and Jay Costan, and I'm so pleased that they were able to be here with us tonight so that I can express our deep gratitude to them. Thank you. Our speaker for tonight was raised in the U.S., but left for doctoral studies at Cambridge, and then spent the next several decades at Corpus Christi College at the University of Oxford, where she was part of the first wave of ordained women priests in England. She has since been part of the General Synod of the Church of England and has served on the commission that recommends bishops to the Prime Minister. She's now Emerita Fellow and Reader in Church History, and her academic work has largely concerned the post-Reformation English Church. Her books include Prayer Book and People in Elizabethan and Stuart England, early Stuart England, Religion in Revolutionary England, and the Established Church, Past, Present, and Future. Recently, her attention has turned to the literary history of Anglicanism, and having co-edited a volume on Anglican women novelists, she is now engaged with an Episcopal woman poet, Vassar Miller. And as we will hear tonight and for the next 2 evenings, this former Poet Laureate of Texas and Pulitzer Prize nominee addressed in her work one of the most shocking and scandalous topics in all of 20th century literature: God and religion. So here to help us properly appreciate the work of this poet and disability rights activist, speaking on poetry, faith, and subterfuge in the work of Vassar Miller. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Reverend Canon, Dr. Judith Maltby.
Thank you, John, and it's always a pleasure to be at Virginia Theological Seminary. And all of you, I hope, have a handout. Holy Week. The churches grow hysterical with grief, and we who rarely shed a tear save for ourselves wring corporate hands as the whole week dissolves in the fogs and vapors of our misery over your ancient pain we dare not see daily renewed as all the world revolves on its axis of hurt and hate and crisscrossed loves. The air gone gummy with piosity. We interrupt our fasts with artichoke and cheese. A few poor beasts exult maybe at being spared our gluttonous rages. Were such the reasons, Jesus, your heart broke, and so broke from your cross itself that bolt of furious charity upon the ages? This powerful poem, reflecting on our human devotional practices and the meaning of Christ's death, located in the most sacred week of the Christian year, was first published in 1991, towards the end of her life, by Vassar Miller. Next slide, please. She speaks of Christ's furious charity, which for me captures the character of Miller's faith as she lived it and expressed it in her poetry. Here is not an angry God the Father pouring out his wrath on his only Son, rather than on us who deserve it, according to a particular theological approach to the cross known as penal substitutionary atonement, perhaps less common in the Episcopal Church, but alive and well in the Church of England, I'm afraid. But grace coming from suffering of Christ himself, the identification of his suffering with the suffering of the world, and its furious charity. We, however, entrapped by our devotional and liturgical piosity, fail to see the connection of his ancient pain, daily renewed in the world on its axis of hurt all around us. Who was Vassar Miller, and why isn't she better known? A recurring theme through the small amount of published secondary works and a few unpublished theses, one of the best I'm delighted to report to this audience is a chapter on Miller in a 2005 VTS MTH thesis, is precisely this question. Why is Miller not better known, even amongst those interested in religious poetry of the modern period? And these 3 Costan Lectures, which I'm grateful for the invitation to give, I hope will do something to introduce her skillful and theologically rich poetry to new readers and contextualize her work in terms of her exceptional life story. I need to express gratitude for financial support for my research from Corpus Christi College, Oxford, and from Bishop Andy Doyle and the Diocese of Texas. And helpful contacts in the Diocese of Texas were made thanks to a VTS alumnus, the Reverend David Goldberg. There's a lot of Texas in these lectures. I'm also very grateful to the keeper and his staff of the special collections at the University of Houston, where Vassar Miller's papers are held and managed so professionally. But first, I think I need to explain how I came to be so engaged by Miller's life and work. As some of you know, I'm not principally a scholar of literature, but I'm a historian, particularly what we are now calling the Long Reformation, that period from after Henry VIII through to the restoration of Charles II, which is seen as the formative period of Anglican Christianity. Next slide, please. The emphasis of my own work, as John kindly said, has been on the impact of religious change at the parish level, on parishioners not as passive receptacles to change from above, but also agents of change, as well as agents of resistance. However, I've always had an interest in what you might call Anglican literary culture. Publishing, the first thing I published after Prayer Book and People was a long essay on an early imitator of George Herbert, the now almost completely forgotten 17th century poet, Christopher Harvey. I wouldn't recommend running out and reading him, however. I became increasingly interested in the 20th century British novelist Rose Macaulay. I was introduced to her by my doctoral supervisor in Cambridge, not simply as an enjoyable author, but as an important and now overlooked, there may be a theme here, Anglican apologist. I think of her as the Graham Greene of Anglicanism, and if you've never read Towers of Trebizond, you must. It is the Anglican novel of the 20th century. I published an article about her attitudes towards the relationship of the Reformation to understanding the nature of Anglicanism. And in common with much of the high church tradition, her attitude towards the Reformation was, shall we say, a bit ambivalent, if not hostile. And growing up as I did in the Beretta belt of the Episcopal Church, these attitudes were very familiar to me. Oh dear, she wrote to a priest friend in the early 50s, if only the Reformation had happened differently. That is, free of the influence of those pesky Puritans. But of more interest for the purposes of these lectures is what Macaulay said about the challenges of being a Christian, and in particular an Anglican public intellectual in 1950s Britain. When challenged at a dinner party about her views on the Eucharist, she recorded in a letter to a friend, "She didn't really think she was eating God. Did I really? I said I did. They accept Roman Catholicism as a kind of mania that they know and allow for in their friends. But Anglicanism, in this apparently sane and civilized friend, is more difficult to swallow." She's writing in the 1950s. She was convinced that amongst the British intelligentsia, the only tolerated form of Christianity for a respectable intellectual or artist was Roman Catholicism, but only because of its perceived eccentricities. So my interest in Macaulay led to a deeply enjoyable project, next slide please, co-edited with my good friend, Professor Alison Schell of University College London, Anglican Women Novelists in 2019. A good deal of the introduction to that book, or my half of it, was written here in the Bishop Payne Library when I was a guest of the seminary in 2018. And we're planning, Alison and I, with two other colleagues, an anthology. We've decided to go down that route rather than a collection of essays on Anglican women poets. And that's such a massive job that we're bringing in help on that, Professor Emma Mason of Warwick University and Professor Helen Wilcox of Bangor University. Now, I haven't come across any evidence that Miller ever read Macaulay, though she was extraordinarily well read. Nonetheless, there are some striking similarities in what these two women writers say about being taken seriously by critics as an artist and an intellectual if one is a person of faith, particularly Christian and Anglican or mainstream Protestant. So this project on Vassar Miller is part of a wider academic interest in Anglican literary culture, and in particular the contribution, often overlooked, of women to it. Next slide, please. This led to a course on the Anglican literary tradition earlier this year at the Anglican Center in Rome, which I led with Professor Helen Wilcox. Shameless self-promotion here. If you're in the UK in March, Helen and I are reprising this course at the wonderful Gladstone's Library in North Wales. If you've never been to Gladstone's Library, you must visit. Now, as Alison and I remarked in our introduction to Anglican women novelists, before the ordination of women in the 20th century, it was as novelists, hymn writers, and poets that Anglican women could carve out a public voice in the life of the church. So you may have guessed that Miller, though not a cradle Anglican like Macaulay, but one by choice, spent a considerable amount of her life as an Episcopalian, and that will be the main theme of Lecture 3. The late Bruce Kellner, professor who died in 2019, professor of English at Millersville University in Pennsylvania, is a crucial biographical source for Miller. He became a long and great friend and supporter of hers, both personally and in promoting her work. Kellner, writing shortly after Miller's death, said he first came across a poem of hers in a forgotten anthology. And that is exactly my own experience. And like me, he didn't know if Vassar Miller was a man or a woman. I do, however, remember the anthology. Next slide, please. It was chapters into verse, a 2-volume anthology which links Anglophone poetry over 5 centuries to specific biblical passages. And over decades of preaching, it has saved more than a few sermons for me, sort of passing on all sorts of knowledge to the seminarians here. Over decades of preaching, it's done that for me, and I was preparing to preach a series of Holy Week addresses, hoping to avoid, as best one can, going gummy with piosity, though I didn't know the phrase at the time. And Judas, next poem on your handout, was the first poem by Miller I ever read. Always I lay upon the brink of love, impotent, waiting till the waters stirred, and no one healed my weakness with a word, for no words healed me without words to prove my heart, which, when the kiss of Mary wove his shroud, my tongueless anguish spurred to cool descent, and which, each time I heard John whisper to him, moaned but could not move. While Peter deeply drowsed within love's deep, I cramped upon its margin, glad to share the sop Christ gave me, yet its bitter bite dried up my ducts. Praise Peter, who could weep his sin away, but never see me where I hang, huge teardrop on the cheek of night. Miller here harmonizes the various gospel accounts of Judas and also throws in John 5 and the pool of Bethsaida for good measure. It's a Petrarchian sonnet. It's a dramatic monologue, a form that is the dramatic monologue I would go on to learn that Miller favored particularly when engaging with biblical stories and characters in her poetry. I'll talk about that in lecture 2. It's been suggested that Auden and Eliot were particular influences on Miller's use of the dramatic monologue, and one immediately thinks of Journey of the Magi, for example. At this poem's heart, Judas's inability to communicate, for no one healed my weakness with a word, for no words healed me without words to prove my heart. If Judas could speak, end his tongueless anguish, it would have been enough to open the floodgates of emotion and break the barrier between him and Jesus. Silence, in this case, or being silenced, is a recurring theme in Miller's large poetic output. Next slide, please. Her collected poems, published in 1999, is nearly 350 pages long. Her 1960 collection, Wage War on Silence, the volume that earned her a Pulitzer nomination in 1961, in particular delves deeply into this theme and will be discussed further tonight and also tomorrow night. In an interview in 1984, Miller remarks that part of her focus on silence is the fact that I have a speech impediment and can't express myself as freely as I might. More on that shortly. So you can see, I hope, just what an arresting introduction to a completely unknown to me that poem was. Who was Vassar Miller? Well, and I want to give you an overview of her life and her literary outputs. Miller was born in 1924 and lived her whole life in Houston, Texas, although she did travel around the United States and made at least one trip to Europe. She also lived her whole life with severe cerebral palsy. Both her mobility and her speech were greatly impaired. But before I go into depth on Miller's disability, I want to, because I think she would want it this way, to explore first her life and the quality of her literary publications. Miller spoke of her resentment when she was pigeonholed as a disabled poet, or that her disability became the lens for reading her work. She wrote in 1985 that, "I've often been told, if you weren't handicapped, you probably wouldn't write poetry. What about the myriad other poets who have no visible handicap?" And then this is a striking phrase. "The afflicted one is the bait dropped in the waters of chaos to catch whatever fish of meaning that may surface, and so let normal humanity know that, after all, everything is well." Her mother, also Vassar, died when Miller was about a year old, and her father, a prosperous Houstonian developer named Jesse Gustavus Miller, remarried. Miller's stepmother would become a key figure in fighting for Vassar's education, taught her to read and write, persevered with the public school authorities, and eventually Miller was able to enter mainstream schooling for her junior and senior high school education, a remarkable achievement for the late 1930s. The University of Houston then followed, earning a BS in 1947 and an MA in English in 1952. Her MA thesis was on the mysticism of an American poet whose recognition has also receded, Edwin Arlington Robinson. Yes, I had to look him up too, whose poetry significantly engages a great deal with isolation, loneliness, and the struggle of the poet to find the words. Those characteristics drew Miller to Robinson, and she spoke of him, she quotes him in an interview saying, "Poetry is saying what cannot be said. All the ironies of that sentence. She won awards for her poetry and writing in high school. Her own assessment of her juvenilia was, she said, a passable imitation of hymns. Being of a pious turn of mind, I wanted to be a hymn writer. Hymn writing, of course, was a literary form that was permitted to women when other forms of religious expression and leadership were not. In fact, Miller made a submission for consideration for the Episcopal Church's revision of its 1940 hymnal. More of that in Lecture 3. University brought more awards, including a statewide contest for college students. Importantly, she had instructors who encouraged her to write. She was twice alternate Poet Laureate of Texas and once Poet Laureate. Strikingly, she was made an alternate Poet Laureate, even though 2 years before she'd been nominated for the Pulitzer. You might have think that would have pushed her to the top. Poems were published in a variety of literary journals, the first in the Hopkins Review. Her first real break, as she put it, came from a small press, the New Orleans Poetry Journal. The editor, a doctor turned poet late in life, decided to start publishing volumes of poetry, and Miller's was one of his first. Adam's Footprint was published in 1956 when she was 32. The major literary critic, Howard Nemerov, reviewed it positively for a piece on younger poets in the Kenyon Review in 1958. Nemirov's praise was not unalloyed. He speaks of some lapses into sentimentality. Nonetheless, quoting him here, the poems are at their best brilliant works of language with fine energy, rich, strange, accurate, beautifully paced. And in a vivid turn of phrase, he says, these are poems you can read over many times, as against the other kind, which, like Kleenex, is meant to be used only once and thrown away. I've never looked at Kleenex the same way after that. Significantly, for our purposes, Nemerov, writing, remember, in 1958, remarks, since religious poetry is, of all things, the one most commonly supposed to have become impossible, it is deeply a pleasure to come upon the work of Vassar Miller. Among her papers in Houston is a letter from a creative writing professor at Rice University from 1952. She would have been in her late 20s. Miller had sent him some of her poetry, a portion of which became Adam's Footprint. Despite thinking some of her poetry extraordinarily fine, he advised her in the strongest terms to abandon religious poetry. Quote, "It narrows the stream into a channel too small to edify many people." Thank goodness Miller did not follow his advice. Now, it could be said that publishing her first book in the 1950s, she benefited from what you might call the air pocket carved out from the oxygen-sucking condescension of many critics for religious poetry, especially Christian poetry, by T.S. Eliot. His conversion to Christianity, especially to its Anglican form, has continued to baffle and discomfort many admirers of someone they otherwise see as a towering intellectual. How could he believe that stuff, right? One critic describes the poetic mood in the 1950s as more Eliot-esque and favorable to religious poetry. But when her last volume, Struggling to Swim on Concrete, appeared in 1984, the mood was quite other. Even the titles of her volumes could be said to move from the promise of Eden, Adam's Footprint, to cruel struggle, struggling to swim on concrete. After Adam's Footprint, from the 1960s through the 80s, that pocket became smaller and the air thinner to appreciate a poet who explored religious, especially mainstream Christian themes. This almost hostile, or frankly just hostile, cultural context for the reception of her work is something Miller was very aware of. Reviewing her fellow Texan and Episcopalian poet, James Newcomer, I'd never heard of him, but I came across his work in her papers. In 1984, she wrote, "For a poet to be a Christian is something like the kiss of death." Now, a Roman Catholic has a faint chance of being respectable in literary circles, only faint. But when T.S. Eliot became a Christian, the literary world critics cried, "Traitor." However, Nemirov's regard for Miller would not diminish, and during his tenure as consultant in poetry for the Library of Congress, he curated a project of poets recording their work. Miller's poems were read aloud by someone else, and edited a collection of essays, Poets on Poetry, in 1966, which has a wonderful essay by Miller in it. A marked feature of Miller's work is her use, not exclusively, but a lot, of the traditional poetic forms, the sonnet in particular. Her remarkable poem, Love's Bitten Tongue, in her last volume of poetry, Struggling to Swim on Concrete, is a complex poem of 22 stanzas on the life of Christ, modeled on John Donne's La Corona. Miller triples Donne's achievement. La Corona is only 7 stanzas long. Take that, John Donne. In this form, the last line of the stanza is the first line of the next stanza. It takes a poet of exceptional skill to work within such a disciplined form. Miller's attraction to the structure and discipline of traditional poetic forms has, I think, led to some overly simplistic connections about order in her verse, contrasting with the disorder caused by her disability, even her disordered body itself. She was irked by such two-dimensional readings of her work. Now, Miller chose her titles with great care, and the first poem in each book often gives its name to the volume. In the title poem, Adam's Footprint, which I have included on your handout, I'm not going to read it out, though, she is not so much concerned with the fall. She writes, "How could a tree be so unclean? Nobody knows but Augustine." That is my favorite rhyme in Vassar Miller. And as with Christ, she's much more concerned not with the fall, but with Christ's pursuit of us. He's after us to catch us with grace in his net. Adam is each of us, and the general theme of the collection is a humane mutuality and acceptance. After Adam's Footprint, Miller published a poem in the Paris Review, and its editor suggested she try Wesleyan University Press, which produced her next 3 collections, Wage War on Silence, My Bones Being Wiser, and Onions and Roses, all published in the 1960s. Wage War on Silence earned her that Pulitzer nomination. The publisher's Liverite took If I Could Sleep Deeply Enough, 1974. A press local to Houston, Wings, published 2 short chapbooks, Small Change, 1976, and the remarkable Approaching Nada, 1977. Her reputation by that time warranted publication of new and selected poems, if we could have the next slide, by the Austin-based Latitude Press, run by her friend Robert Bonazai, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, in 1981. It included a new set of poems as well, under the title of The Sun Has No History. The cover illustration is by Thomas Merton. The first poem is entitled Posthumous Letter to Thomas Merton, and more about that tomorrow. Miller has a lot of interesting things to say about Merton. The poet Denise Levertov wrote the foreword for this selected poems, comparing Miller to George Herbert, Christina Rossetti, and the Canadian poet Margaret Avison. Levertov wrote, these are poems that seem to call for something other than print and paper. One imagines them carved in stone, engraved in metal. The incised words go deep. And despite recognition from an established poet like Levertov, the noted Texan screenwriter and novelist, the author of the Lonesome Dove novels, Larry McMurtry, deserves the credit for bringing Miller back into the attention, at least of the Texas literati in the early 1980s, with a fiery speech at the Fort Worth Art Museum, published in the Texas Observer, in which he bemoaned Miller's lack of recognition. He just goes after the general state of arts and letters in Texas. Before the internet, it was the equivalent of going viral in terms of the sort of debate it generated. Her last volume, the evocatively titled Struggling to Swim on Concrete, was published by her original publisher, the New Orleans Poetry Journal. Now, over the course of these volumes of poetry, of course, Miller's style and thinking develop, as you would expect of any gifted artist. Next slide, please. Wage War on Silence, 1960, has the overarching theme of poetry's vocation to articulate what cannot be articulated. This is not the silence, which is often romanticized, I might say even fetishized in certain spiritual traditions. Miller writes that the war on silence suggests, quote, the very nature of poetry, which is war waged on the silence of misunderstanding between men, on the silence of God that Christ endured on the cross, summing up in himself our individual endurances. So again, that Christology that's about identification with us. My Bones Being Wiser takes its title from a poem of that name, subtitled A Eucharistic Meditation, and the volume is rich in liturgical references. Short extract from that poem, which is not on your handout. My eyes weep, my heart refuses to lift its head. Still at thy comfortable words, my bones, thrice deniers, stretch high, singing a triple holy. Just one of many allusions in her work to worship and liturgy, particularly the Anglican liturgy. Onions and Roses is a more confessional and autobiographical in content, with more personal acknowledgement of her disability, such as approaching my birthday. My mother bore me, as I say, then died shortly thereafter, no doubt of her disgust, and left me her disease, when I grew up to wither into truth. Not a sentimental poet. If I Could Sleep Deeply Enough, in 1974, contains numerous poems on sleep, on the restoration it provides, but also the forgetfulness and release from physical pain and exhaustive introspection. Numerous poems explore how waking up returns her to harsh reality. She has also become more experimental in style in that volume, few poems employing rhyme and only 3 sonnets. Small Change and Approaching Nada are short chapbooks. Small Change containing only 16 poems, and Approaching Nada containing 1 remarkable poem of a few pages. In the poem Accepting, in Small Change, Jesus is, quote, pioneer in pain. Lord, serene on your symbol, you plant your flag on pain's last outpost. You, pioneer in pain, reclaim its wastes, and so you prove it, no more an alien planet. Approaching Nada was written in a few days in March 1977 during a visit to Phoenix, unusual for Miller as she preferred writing at home, she said. In part, it was inspired by the desert landscape and the religious history of the region. Bruce Kellner, her English professor friend, describes Approaching Nada as a long meditation on time and faith, poetry and history, and is itself rich in extravagance and risk. And there is a kind of arc in the 2 decades from Adam's footprint to Approaching Nada. In Adam's footprint, the foot of Adam leaves its mark of some child scrambling in the dark, to her willingness in Approaching Nada to trace footsteps of princes, rebels, and martyrs, and formed by her Christology. It's a very Christological poem. One critic has remarked there is a kind of arc of innocence from Adam's footprint through experience to a second innocence in approaching nada. Her last volume of poetry, though her collected poems contain previously unpublished material, the evocatively entitled Struggling to Swim on Concrete, contains moving poems exploring loneliness and sexual desire, religious themes such as prayer and the Eucharist. It also contains her technically brilliant sonnet sequence, Love's Bitten Tongue, which I've already mentioned, that sequence of 22 English sonnets on the life and work of Christ. Despite the brilliance of this collection, one reviewer said that in Love's Bitten Tongue, Miller harrows hell. So, who would not like their work described like that? Another reviewer, D.E. Richardson, who admires the volume but laments the hostile critical environment of 1980s America for poetry with such strong religious, especially Christian allusions. He wrote, "The tradition that we Americans should have no tradition but a landscape and a sky and our own aloneness with God is, of course, a new and old American tradition. That we live in a landscape without history is a characteristic American attitude. It forces us to deny the truth that the landscape itself has a history." And of course, had a people already living in it, but he doesn't make that point. Richardson goes on to comment on that, what he calls the compromise, this unyielding mythos of historical timelessness requires when it confronts a revealed version of history in a religion like Christianity. Kenneth McLean, in his contribution to Hart's Invention, this is the one book of essays about Miller, adds to Richardson's assessment. Beyond the quite understandable necessity of avoiding Bible-thumping mindlessness or ritualistic dogmatism, this compromise may be one way of expressing the unwillingness of the Christian believers among our poets to express any religious commitment openly, as Vassar Miller has done. McLean reflects that however inevitable and in a sense constitutionally necessary this separation of church and poetic statement may be, he says, one cannot believe it has been good for the soul of American Christianity to have its expressions of faith reduced to bourgeois smugness. For American literature to have seen some of its best talents driven into alien relation to it, for the American political democracy to have been deprived of the moral zeal of any but the most embarrassing or threatening of its political proponents of Christian ideology. He's writing in the mid-1980s. He concludes that Vassar Miller bravely did not add to all our failures in this regard, and that is greatly to her credit. Miller also edited what is believed to be the first of its kind, next slide please, a literary anthology on disability, Despite This Flesh, the Disabled in Stories and Poems, published by the University of Texas Press, 1985. The title comes from Robert Browning. Let us not always say, spite this flesh today, I strove, made head, gained ground upon the whole. Miller's own working title for the book was Whispered in Chambers, Shout It from the Rooftops, a likely reference from Luke 12 and Matthew 10, for nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, what you hear whispered, proclaim from the housetops. Perhaps unfashionable now, but Miller was adamant that the anthology should deal exclusively with physical disability. And I'll talk more about the project in tomorrow's lecture. 7 years before her death, her collected poems, along with a number of previously unpublished poems, were published as If I Had Wheels or Love. These are her major publications. Like many modern poets, her works are scattered across more than 50 anthologies, hundreds of periodicals, both in English and in translation. So please forgive this rather shallow chronological gallop through Miller's publications, but I wanted to give you an overview. And every single one of her books I have mentioned is out of print. But you can find them on the internet. After her father's death, Miller set up her own household in the early 1960s, not far from St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Houston's Museum District. Next slide, please. She had some income from teaching creative writing at St. John's School and St. Thomas University, but largely, as far as I can tell, lived off a trust fund established by her father. Her final years were tragic, and this is an invitation for people to come around for a party at her house, and it's being preceded by Holy Communion, and the invitation says, you don't have to come to Holy Communion, but it's at this time, you can come after. So she loved entertaining. Her final years were tragic. The trust fund ran out, and Miller was reduced to poverty. On a visit to Houston, Kellner found her living in squalid conditions in a nursing home, neglected by her state-appointed conservator. Because of her impaired speech, Kellner said the staff treated her as a simpleton. He took it upon himself to improve her situation and informed the then governor, George W. Bush, about the conditions a former Poet Laureate of Texas was living in. Bush's office intervened, appointed a new and diligent conservator, and had Miller moved to a better facility. She died in 1998. Now, her friend of many years, Professor Bruce Kellner, who I've already mentioned, gives a frank account of the extent of her disability in an article published shortly after her death in the journal Literature and Medicine. Miller had been on its editorial board, and it connected her to an important national network, as we'll see in tomorrow's lecture. Joining the Millersville faculty in 1969, Kellner soon learned that Miller sometimes visited a friend there. He was keen to invite her to talk about her work. It was then he learned the nature and depth of her disability, and he writes about it unsparingly, so please be prepared. She was virtually helpless, appallingly afflicted with cerebral palsy, her arms and legs flailing or contracting awkwardly, and her voice an impenetrable series of graveled groaning and laughing that could not be distinguished one from the other. Following her conversation was nearly impossible, I was told. One hand had atrophied. She usually walked with someone on her elbow. She drooled. She went up and down steps one at a time from a sitting position. Meeting her, especially for the first time, they promised me, could be unnerving. I've saved this account for late in this lecture because I wanted to give you an appreciation of her work first. I already mentioned how Miller resented her poetry just being read through a disability lens. Kellner first invited Miller to Millersville in 1972 and recalls receiving a beautifully typed letter, though one obviously signed with great effort. Next slide, please. This is not that letter, but it's beautifully typed, and you can see the signature took some effort. He candidly writes that despite being warned, he was unnerved by her condition upon meeting her. She spoke, quote, with tremendous difficulty, every syllable seeming torn out of her guts. Kellner maintained that after a while, she was not hard to understand because her precision was well nigh perfect. But I think that's a testimony to Kellner's effort and energy that he put into that. At the reading, two students, along with Kellner, performed most of Miller's poetry, so she chose to read a few herself. This friendship grew, and Miller returned to Millersville, and the two sometimes traveled together for poetry readings and conferences. Kellner describes how Miller would begin with a few lines of a poem and then someone else would take over the reading. Next slide, please. Just some pictures of Miller at different ages. I mentioned earlier that Miller was highly critical of interpretations of her work which used knowledge of her disability as the interpretive framework through which to read her poetry. That said, her exasperation at such readers and other ill-informed attitudes about people with disabilities did not stop her from either engaging with the themes of disability and suffering in her poetry, nor did it impede her from becoming what we would now call a disability rights activist in the 1970s and 80s. I will talk more about both of those topics, her poetic engagement and her public and church activism, in the following lectures, particularly tomorrow. I have already referred to her poem, Adam's Footprint, which speaks of the foot of Adam leaves the mark of some child scrabbling in the dark. Also from that collection are 3 poems, Epitaph for a Cripple, Consolations of Relativity, and Spastic Child, all of which address physical disability like her own, but speaks in the third person rather than the first, and directs, as Janice Thompson has put it, the reader's gaze to the disabled subject without revealing or denying any specific connection to herself. So I'm now going to we're going to look at Epitaph for a Cripple, which is on your handout. And note at the start of each stanza the references to parts of the body. Feet that floundering go no way of your own will, numb with eternity, you now have gained your goal. Fingers writhed from weaving like crabs with claws torn loose. You mold in your unmoving the perfect shape of peace. Tongue entangled in the ravels of confusion, you have learned silence soon, the language of precision. Body, wry reproach to athlete mind. Lie down your lubber limbs here, couch, graced with the state of stone. In the last part of this lecture, I'm going to talk about what you might call the physicality of writing. Now, Miller's body, wry reproach to athlete mind, that's such a fantastic phrase, reminds us all, especially for those of us for whom writing is a major part of what we do, that writing is not only a creative process, but a physical one. Historians of literacy make the point that reading and writing are separate skills, though the latter is dependent on the former. That is to say, being able to read is not dependent on being able to write. Writing is, as distinct from dictating, is a physical act, whether holding a pencil or a pen or typing on a keyboard. And thinking of the severity of Miller's disability, as described by Kellner, raises an obvious question. How did she write in practical terms? Next slide, please. Miller's creativity was liberated by technology. It was called a typewriter. And I have provided a picture for the younger members of the audience. This is, I hope, at least from Google Images, is an Underwood from the 1930s. I've already mentioned that Miller's stepmother successfully educated her at home, enabling Vassar at age 12 to attend 6th grade, taking only one class. But by the time I finished high school, she records, I was carrying the normal academic load. Miller started writing poetry when she was 8. Her father lugged home every evening his big office typewriter. She writes, I began fooling around with words, and I found I could make up sentences that rhyme. In due course, he bought her a Smith Corona portable from a pawn shop. It was the Depression, she notes, and I pounded on that thing until college. In 1983, in an interview for Kaleidoscope, the national literary and arts magazine for the disabled, Miller remarks that all she needs to write is a typewriter, and for years a manual. But now I have an electric one, and that has spoiled me. It has enabled me to use more than one finger. I now use 3. In her papers in the University of Houston Special Collections, some items from the late 80s were clearly produced on a dot matrix printer, indicating the use of an early version of a word processor. In another interview in the 1980s, Miller comments in a prescient way that computers will be revolutionary for people with disabilities. But let's stick with this older technology which revolutionized life for Miller, and close this first lecture with a highly autobiographical poem, which first appeared as a new poem in her Selected and New Poems in 1981. It's on your handout. And it tells of that very incident of her father arriving home from the office with the Underwood. Subterfuge. I remember my father, slight, staggering in with his Underwood, bearing it in his arms like an awkward bouquet for his spastic child who sits down on the floor, one knee on the frame of the typewriter, and holding her left wrist with her right hand. In that precision known to the crippled, pecks at the keys with a sparrow's preoccupation, falling by chance on rhyme, novel and curious bubble blown with magic pipe, she tries them over and over, spellbound by life's crashing in a chord or against itself, pretending pretense and playing at playing. She does her childhood backward, as children do, her fun a delaying action against what she knows. My father must lose her, his runaway on her treadmill, will lose the terrible favor that life has done him, as she toils at tomorrow, tensed at her makeshift toy. Now, the physicality of this poem is powerful. The child who sits down on the floor, one knee on the frame of the typewriter, holding her left wrist with her right hand, in that precision known to the crippled, pecks at the keys with a sparrow's preoccupation. The sheer effort of one knee on the frame of the typewriter, holding her left wrist with her right hand, as in that autobiographical fragment cited above, the gift of the Underwood, her father bearing it in his arms like an awkward bouquet, allowed her to start, she wrote, fooling around with words, and I found I could make up sentences that rhyme. Rendered in the poem as falling by chance on rhyme, novel and curious bubble blown with magic pipe, she tries them over and over, spellbound by life's clashing in a chord or against itself. It is playing at playing. Subterfuge, of course, can mean a stratagem to justify one's conduct or conceal one's true attitude, a smokescreen. It has been suggested that this is her first poem in which she outs herself as disabled, as opposed to writing in the third person. But in fact, it does happen in works going back to the 1960s. Also, subterfuge has a rarer meaning, which I feel Miller may have known, must have known, and that is as a source or place of shelter and protection. Robert Bonazai, a friend as well as one of her publishers, comments that for Miller, the typewriter became, quote, an instrument of transformation. That's it. As she toils at her tomorrow, was that her future vocation as a poet? As she toils at tomorrow, tensed at her makeshift toy. Now, in the next 2 lectures, I will discuss in more depth Miller's theology and biblical interpretation, as well as her equality activism. But I hope this evening I've made a case for an intellectual and a poet who is long neglected and who deserves our better attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maltby. We do have time for some questions, and because we are live streaming the lecture tonight, I would ask you to speak into the microphones. I think Beth and I have microphones on each side of the congregation.
It does feel very chapel-like in here.
Yes, Peggy.
She was extraordinary. Can it on? Okay, I don't know. She seemed to be extraordinarily prolific, and I'm just wondering about the process of in the process of writing. Did she do a lot of revision, and how did she do this revision?
That's a very good question, and amongst her papers, about 20 boxes of her papers in the special collections at the University of Houston. I've seen some evidence of revision, and certainly I haven't had the time yet to go through everything line by line. I have come across some poems that the published version is different from the typed version in her papers. But there isn't a lot of, the way that you get with T.S. Eliot, that edition of the four quartets that Helen Gardner did, which, you've got you really see the work being developed. There just isn't that evidence there. And, I don't know if her sparrow's precision was such that she really did. I mean, it was such a physical act to get it on the paper that she didn't revise a lot. It's a good question. It is exceptionally extraordinary. Yeah, it could be exceptionally extraordinary, but anyway, yeah.
I wonder if you could comment on her spiritual upbringing a little bit, especially participation in corporate worship.
Yep. Well, that's lecture 3. So, yes, she grew up in a moderately Presbyterian household, and that was her parents. She had a Roman Catholic grandfather. She starts attending the Episcopal Church after in her 20s, late 20s, I think it is. And she had, never diss the Christmas Eve service, because she talks about how she was, they attended the Episcopal Church for Christmas Eve, and it made an impression on her, and so, that was her way in. So Christmas and Easter, don't diss them. Besides, they're being fundamental to the faith. But in terms of, future clergy here, they are opportunities. So, but I will, she's quite an involved member of her parish. I don't want to give all my secrets away for the third lecture.
Hi, I'm Caroline. Thank you so much for being here tonight and for the next few days, even. You mentioned in the beginning when you went to meet her that some others told you it might be, jarring. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about your visit with her. And also, I missed it when writing down my notes, the name of the poem where she spoke about her mother dying shortly after she was born.
Yes.
I'd like to read that one, but I didn't quite hear the name.
Right,
of the
so
poem.
that's, I think it's Approaching My Birthday is that poem.
Okay.
And I was describing Bruce Kellner's description of her. I never met Vassar Miller.
Met. Yeah. Oh, okay.
So he's describing, who was a professor of English at Millersville University in Pennsylvania, and he was describing how other people had described her to him, and then also his own reaction to meeting Vassar. He has some extraordinary stories about them going on road trips together to conferences, and he was himself also a minor poet, not in Vassar's league, and I think he have been the first to say that. you know, because of the nature of her disability, he's quite unsparing, Kellner, and he talks about they're on a Greyhound bus, and she gets stuck in the toilet and can't get out, and so he has to help her out, and you know, just the kind of embarrassment of all of that, and of course, the public transport making no concessions of any kind to people with disabilities. And she herself, one of her disability activism things, she was, you know, very keen on airlines upping their game, and wrote to the New York Times about it and things like that. But Kellner was pretty key in helping her be able to travel, and also as I will go into more depth in the subsequent lectures, you know, he was a kind of way into a national intellectual world. This journal, Literature and Medicine, which is still an academic journal publishing today, she was in on the ground floor of that, and that connected her to an academic community. And of course, she loved to entertain. She had lots of friends. Nonetheless, a lot of the poetry is about loneliness. And it is this weird, baffling thing about how under-recognized she was. And painful, and it was painful for her, I think. And I can only put it down to the cerebral palsy, I think. I think it is about our attitudes towards people with disabilities. And, you know, it can be particularly at the severe end, it can be a very unsettling disability to be around. And one of the things, you know, because I've lived in England since my 20s, as you may have guessed, my accent has gone a bit all over the place, but, you know, with the internet-y thing that's happened in the world, you know, I can now listen to National Public Radio in a way I couldn't in my first few decades in the UK. And I've been really struck by the role of something like Fresh Air plays in informing Americans about literary and cultural topics. And of course, she couldn't do radio. And so she couldn't do television. So, you know, radio hates dead air. That's the worst thing, you know. So that's I think, part of the explanation. And so her achievements are even more remarkable, I think, as a result of that.
Thank you for such a splendid lecture and feeding our appetite for the next two. You mentioned that she was very widely read, and I wonder what you think her major influences were, theologically, but also poetically. She wrote on Robinson, I take it, for her master's work, but perhaps there are others. You mentioned Eliot and Auden.
Yeah. I mean, Dickinson, I think, is a huge influence on her. She talks about the metaphysicals, that you know, outdoing Donne is, and I'm sorry, I can't really, it's such a long, complicated poem that I have decided I couldn't really talk about it in the lectures, but if we want to organize an impromptu poetry reading, let's do that at some point before I leave on the 22nd. The metaphysicals, Herbert, in my third lecture in particular, I'm going to talk about the connections with George Herbert that picks up in her, particularly her more overtly religious poetry. She writes about the church, you know, she does a very George Herbert thing. She writes about the church year, she writes about the sacraments, she writes about the priesthood. in poems, and there are real Herbertian influences in that. She did read a lot of Merton and talks about him. She obviously read the early, she read her Augustine, to quote with that one. That is the best rhyme in Vassar Miller. Nobody knows but Augustine. She did read in the early church. She read medieval. Her poetry is littered with there's references to Saint Bernard. Kate and I were, you and I were discussing, what I just said something out of my ignorance to you, and you said, well, of course, that's Abelard. And I went, oh, yes, of course, it's Abelard. Of course it is. Of course, I knew that. So she is widely read. There's an autobiographical fragment when she talks about, and she starts attending St. Stephen's. She's befriended by an older member of the congregation who introduces her to Tillich and Buber, she talks about. So it's very wide-ranging set of theological influences and general cultural influences. Kellner talks about, maybe getting her to write an autobiography towards the end of her life, and some graduate students from the University of Houston helping with that, but it never happened. There are these short biographical fragments, really, in her papers, which I am largely reliant on for piecing her life together, as well as this moving piece by Bruce Kellner that was published shortly after her life. I have talked to one person who knew her when I was in Houston 2 years ago, and he was, a young man in the 80s, or 70s or 80s at St. Stephen's, and I showed him that poem Subterfuge, and he said that's exactly what it looked like when he watched her work. But he didn't really know she was a poet. He just thought she was a member of the, congregation. Yes, she does, and in fact, she has she has a poem about Flannery O'Connor. I don't know if that's referenced. I'll have to go back to that poem. It's a lot of poems, Kate. And I haven't entirely, committed all of them to memory yet. But she does talk about she has wide. There are a lot of musical references also in her poetry to types of music, and also Bach crops up from time to time as well.
Place in Texas had. I mean, she was there in Houston fairly stably. How did that show up, or how does that matter for her poetry?
That's amongst the secondary material on her, which is not extensive, but there is a little bit of a battle about, is she a should we think of her as a Texan poet? And some people say she never writes about Texas, but actually there are some poems that are very evocative, particularly of that Gulf Coast area, and the weather, hurricanes, one or two that are clearly reflecting on the racism of South Texas, and so it's actually, in terms of the reception, it's quite mixed. Some of her, she gets talked about as a Southern poet in some critics' writings, and which of course puts her with Flannery. That's a very that's a cool thing to be, because that's what Flannery O'Connor is. And, but it's subject matter-wise, it's in a few poems, it's not a major concern of hers.
I think we have time for maybe for one more question. If there's one more. Oh,
You gonna ask one, Mark?
I'm sorry, I didn't see it.
This presentation has really brought Vassar's life alive this evening, and I'm really grateful for that. It's been really captivating. Something I'm really struck by listening to these various descriptions is just how involuntarily vulnerable she was all the time. The image of her in the Greyhound or at that state facility is always really, is very visceral to me. And I'm curious if she just had somebody in her life who helped her to feel strong, or whether she had a soft place, if you will, in her life, or if she was truly as alone as it seems.
She did have a good body of friends, and she had a maid that she was very fond of. I don't think she lived with her, but she would come in daily and help. But as far as I can tell, there was never a partner or a lover. The whole theme of sexual desire and sexual activity is something but she does talk about it in her poetry. And again, you see, you have to come back. I think it's tomorrow's lecture. Tomorrow's lecture. I will talk about that because it also fits in with her advocacy for people with disabilities. And one of the things she can't stand, amongst all, there's a very long list of things she can't stand, but is the assumption that, of an asexuality for people with certain kinds of disabilities.
Well, thank you very much, Judith, and thank you all for coming. If you'll just join me in expressing our appreciation to Dr. Maltby. And I hope to see you tomorrow at 6 o'clock for, I think it's Disability in the Word. Is that right? Yes, good. Thanks again.